But your presentation is an example of how we can start with research and lead into practice. So you're the first one of those today, or for this two-day summit. So I thank you both very much. And I thank Zihan, who's not here and has to work for a living, but her motivation to do this study kind of led to all of this. So much appreciation there. Flavia, where does this leave us time-wise now?
So I think we might take a shorter break, like a
Yeah.
5-minute break, and we'll be able to finish on time.
Good. So I'm a methodologist by trade, and I deal primarily with quantitative methods, though I have a strong affinity and appreciation for qualitative methods. So I just thought I would talk a little bit about the way I see the Global Possibilities Network and what I'm looking forward to doing, because the kind of data that will be coming in represents a relatively rare opportunity for me, since one of my driving interests is in looking at individuals, looking at data one person at a time, which is typically not the approach that is often taken in educational and psychological research. So let's see, can I share my screen?
Yes. And as you do, everyone, now that you got a sense of what we'll be talking about, this session is really focused on research methods and program evaluation. And so Mike Rovine will start us off, and then we'll have several other people who are going to share their work. And then I'll tie it together for us to think about what can we take away from each of these people's work in this area, and then their perspectives on future directions. So Mike Rovine, after you, we will have several other colleagues, and then we'll open it up to your questions as well. Thanks.
Great. So can everybody see that?
Yes.
Okay, so that's me, and that's where I am. And here's what I'm interested in. What's the challenge? Well, working with Mike and Flavio and Andy and a lot of other people, I appreciate the idea that we'd like to help children achieve their most desired goals. And one possibility is to actualize that through possibility development. And you've already seen the 5-step model. What I'd like to concentrate on is assessment. And thinking about assessment, the first thing we would need to understand is at what stage the development of the goals are. And let's just consider the situation where a child has determined what goals they would like to achieve. One of the things that the modelers are interested in is what moves a child toward achieving a goal and what moves a child away from achieving a goal. So the measurement goal involves understanding their system well enough to, for example, maximize resources and minimize barriers. So since I am interested in looking at people one person at a time, the buzzword that's typically used for that kind of an approach is ideographic research methods. We like to think of it as person-specific. And just in case you're checking out the literature, this would be opposed to concentrating on groups, which would typically be referred to as nomothetic. So the obvious, each child is unique. There may be specific characteristics that can help a child achieve. You can place 2 children in roughly the same situation, and one might achieve and the other might not. And the big question is why? So that's the obvious. The subtle. Sometimes group characteristics help to partially explain the child. It will often miss critical individual characteristics. So the knowledge of certain of these individual differences might just help you do a better job in moving the child along toward reaching the goal. And then there's the statistical, and that is averaging can hide things. So if you take a look at the little graphic at the bottom, those are two people. One is improving and the other is not. If you average those two lines, you get no improvement. So those are the kinds of things that I tend to worry about. Another important thing that we need to think about is the fact that things change. We're going to be looking at data longitudinally, and we have to be worried about what is changing so we can build that into our models. And then lots of things, possibly experience, illness, changes in the family situation, local drama, changes in government, changes in priorities, changes in available programs. So now, the idea that underlies most of the modeling strategies is something called system theory. And we like to think of the child as a system. And for our purpose, the system is essentially everything that may indicate whether the child will achieve the goal. Identifying the components of a system is typically a pretty big challenge. Depending on the type of the goal, we can look at the pieces of the system either in a relatively broad or a relatively narrow fashion, depending on what we're trying to describe. So we try to identify as many of the important components of the system as we can. And then as modelers, we're particularly sensitive to the fact that there might be some things that we can look at that we might be able to change. There are going to be some things that we can't change. Some of these things we look at will describe the group to which the child is a member, and some will be unique to that child. So it's always good to start with the conceptual framework. And this comes from Flavio, and I thank you very much. It's based on Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems framework. And the framework provides us with clues as to what we need to look at and assess to determine if there's movement toward the goal. So this is just a wonderful framework. And I just want you to take a look for a second and just see all of the components. And these are all things that we might be interested in looking at depending on our research questions. And another thing that I like about this is it indicates the fact that the child is embedded in the family, in the school. We have that embedded in these other characteristics. And then all of these are embedded in societal characteristics, the culture, the economic system, etc. So when we're interested in measuring things, it could be any of these things that we think might be relevant to describe how the child can move in the direction of a goal. So here's the thing that we have going for us as methodologists, and that is we can think in terms of systems theory. And two of my favorite quotes related to systems theory are that knowledge itself is power, and from George Box, one of my favorite statisticians, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And that's basically the way we take a look at modeling strategies. We know that it's not necessarily going to be correct, but it might help us describe what's going on well enough as to be useful. So there's some general principles for trying to improve just about everything. This goes for engineering, for individual characteristics, for societal characteristics. And they basically go as follows. First of all, we need to represent the fact that every person is creative, which means that in addition to studying people and what they're embedded in, they'll be providing us with information. People we work with are creative. We need to try to take in as much information from as many sources as we can. Secondly, each system generates information. So Systems are providing us with whatever it is we might need to know. We just have to make sure that we collect that information and then use it properly. And the idea of experimental design and research methodology is to allow us to use whatever information comes along as well as possible. So, I am a methodologist, tried and true. So what does the methodologist do? Well, we always like to come equipped with our flying pack and our chest controls, but we essentially help develop measures to help detect those pieces of information that the system is generating. So we help people develop measures. We operationalize conceptual frameworks. We help turn the conceptual framework into a workable model. And then the fun part is we get to model the process. And in modeling the process, we're interested in determining what influences move children toward the goal, determining what influences may move them away from the goal, suggest which of those influences might be changed, and this is, with consultation, and suggest which influences should be changed to improve the outcome, and try to do this all using the best possible design practices. So, what will we monitor? Well, we work with the researcher and they tell us what they think is important. So it could be what supports are available, family supports, community educational opportunities, government programs. Internal characteristics, so the development of interests, dreams, or the goals of the child. If they're headed in a particular direction, whether or not they're hitting their marks, doing the things that are necessary to help them achieve their goal. Staying in bounds, and by that I mean for things that we'd like to look at, like motivation and confidence, are they in whatever bounds are necessary to allow them to move forward? So does their motivation stay high? Do they stay confident that they can achieve what they'd like to aim? An important thing we do is monitoring whether they're moving toward or away from the goal. We try to determine what is influencing that movement and try to determine which of these things might be changed or manipulated and which ones can't. And for those that can be, in consultation, we try to see if we can add whatever is necessary to move individuals toward their goals. And then we're interested in individual differences. As I mentioned, two people in essentially the same situation can have different outcomes in terms of achievement. So we are worried about motivation, confidence, resilience, whether or not they have people they can turn to for support, and then lots of other things. So what will we monitor? Another thing that's really important, because we're essentially looking at individuals across time, is development and change. So how can things change? Well, we can look for trends, essentially whether things are getting better or worse. We can look at relationships among measures. How are all the things we measure related to each other? Is the value of a certain variable contingent on the value of other measured variables? And then the idea of feedback. And that basically means that we can use the current state of our system to suggest what we might expect in the near future and realize that this process repeats. So the way I like to think about this is we have today predicting tomorrow, regardless of which today we're talking about. It could be July the 7th, July the 8th, July the 10th. And then what happens is what happens the next day basically gives an indication of how right or wrong we are, and then we put that information back into the system. So that's the most standard kind of a feedback loop. How do we track changes? Usually there are a lot of very simple ways of doing it. If we're measuring different variables that can be quantified, we can use some very simple approaches that are known as run charts. And you can sort of see what a run chart is. It just monitors a variable for a person and it sees how things are changing. Sometimes we look for certain things in run charts. For example, if this represents some characteristic that we would like to see improve, a very good situation is to see this characteristic shift. So these are the kinds of things we look at. Very often we use very simple charting methods to determine how things are going. Sometimes on our good days, we can use more intensive statistical techniques to take a look at a lot of variables simultaneously and just basically see whether things are moving in a good or a not quite so good direction. So just a very simple example. Imagine 3 variables. One represents a skill acquisition. One represents something that might influence an outcome. And the third might represent a desired outcome. So when I take a look at this, and of course I created this in such a way that I would have something to take a look at, I see the fact that these 2 variables look highly related. And I also see the fact that when this skill is acquired, things seem like they eventually get better in the outcome. So now I become a modeler, which takes my ability to be able to draw a couple of straight lines. And you can see that this characteristic, the influence, is lagging behind the outcome. So with some other considerations, I might actually be able to make the argument that this influence might be helping move the outcome in a desired direction. And then take a look at what happens with the skill acquisition. The skill acquisition occurs, things get better. Even though this looks relatively simple, these are the kinds of things that we initially look at. We can do these in a relatively simple fashion, or we can do them in a relatively high-tech fashion using lots of variables and lots of considerations over lots of occasions. But this is basically the kinds of things we're looking for. Predictive relationships, skill acquisitions that improve things, and then what the relationships among all of these variables are. So once we get this information, then we want to maybe try to generalize a little bit in evaluating success. So if we get to look at enough people, we can try to determine whether or not there are patterns of success. So are there any of these characteristics that look like they're common across more than a few individuals? Which ones seem to be purely idiosyncratic? And then also, can we determine what impedes success? Can patterns of success or failure be typologized so we might know what to look for in the future and how to help in the future? And that's essentially, what we learn about one child tell us what we might expect in other children? And in coming up with our evaluation, we'll be interested in barriers. And actually, George Box refers to these as Murphy's Law, because when you're watching things happen, things can go wrong. And as modelers, what we like to be able to do is have some kind of a response. So the barriers could be lack of resources, family dynamics, lack of educational opportunities, lack of supportive programs. These can represent things that we can suggest to create improvements. And then there is serendipity, what I like to call, or actually not me, but pretty much everybody in the field likes to call Ypres law. And for example, having experience that provides motivation to achieve a goal meeting an influential person who provides a spark, discovering a program that provides resources to help achieve a particular goal. And then I think what's affected me a lot in the development of my career, the luck of the draw at a decision's crossroad. So we look for barriers, we look for things that enhance improvement, and we tell a story. So unfortunately, when we decide what the journey to success looks like, this would be ideal, and that there are relatively few barriers and you're given the proper equipment in order to be able to achieve. But typically roads to success are a lot more complex. And as modelers, what we try to do is show how these develop, and then eventually try to help, suggest, and help people make decisions that tend to move them along a better road. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rovine. We really appreciate that. I learned a lot. I hope everyone else did as well. We now have Andrew Babson and Andy Danilchick, and I'll let you decide who goes next, who are going to share your perspectives on this kind of research.
Andrew, would you like to go first?
All you, man.
All me?
All right,
Okay.
Andy Danilchick, it is you.
All right, and I'll try to do this real fast so we can have actual conversation and maybe answer a question or two. But I'm like Mike Rovine, and I always love learning from you, Mike, and really enjoyed your presentation. You're amazing. And like you, I'm also really interested in understanding development and change with individuals, certainly, but also like in groups and systems. And for me, my passion and how I try to approach that change, especially with intervention work, is through action research. And I do want to say, just briefly, 10 years ago, I learned about what action research was from Sharon Ravitch in a qualitative modes of inquiry class. And I was so inspired by her and her class and her work and action research that I started an action research group with teachers. We called it Teacher Research Group. And I started with a group of students that I taught from an adolescent class and at the graduate level. And it grew into action research group, and it's been around for more than 10 years. And so my work in action research is mostly with educators. And I think it's a powerful way to understand things that are happening, especially when you have the intention of wanting to intervene or change oneself or impact others in a system. And there are lots of different ways that action research can happen. I have a bunch of resources I'm going to put in chat, but maybe I'll start by showing you a little bit of how we did it in possibility mentoring. So there's kind of a link from earlier today. So I'm going to show you, and I did put this in chat a little bit earlier today, and I think I'm showing the wrong one. Let me show the right thing here. Hold on. This should show you the guidelines that we have. So does everyone see possible mentoring research memo? I think that's what we have. All right, so this is the guideline that we have when we start doing the research memos with our mentors. And if you can see in the top part, it just outlines the 5 things you want them to put in a memo. And there's a descriptive part where they describe what's happened during their session. There's an analytical part where they analyze it. And there's an action research part where they answer 2 questions: how well is this working? And their own personal action research question. And by having that action research component, it allows us to, like when Mike Rowan was talking about a feedback loop system, this is our feedback loop system for this project, because we can then understand how mentors are seeing the work happening and how they think students are feeling, mentees are feeling the work happening. And also by the mentors choosing one specific research question to focus on in their practice, it highlights that, illuminates that, and gets them really focused on growing in that area. So if a mentor, and developing a good question, it's based on your interests, what you're wondering, what's confusing. There's so many ways that you can get to a good question. But if you're having a question of like, dealing with resistance in kids, by you focusing on that, it helps you really deal with it and maybe uncover what's going on, be in dialogue with other people. It might impact your practice. In similar ways that when educators, like whether it's a teacher or a leader or a counselor, has things that they want to find out about what's going on in their practice, something that they want to improve on, by creating an inquiry to explore, you're basically putting your resources, and sometimes it's collective because you might be doing with other people, towards making a difference and growing in that area. The other bottom part of this is something that we have all our folks do, whether it's in any project that we use action research, we like to do a researcher identity memo. And I also learned about this from Sharon Ravitch and the work of Joseph Maxwell, who I've had the pleasure of meeting a few times and think he's just a fabulous person. But the researcher identity memo gets you to think about, what do you bring to the work that you're doing? What previous experiences, what beliefs and assumptions do you have? What are your values? Things that might influence what you do. And by exploring this in writing about where you might have some affordances or advantages of what you bring to a work, and where there might be some problem spots or some areas to kind of deal with, we find that this is really helpful when we have folks engaging in cross-cultural work and understanding their identity and the identities of the people they work with. And it could really lead to good growth, or starting conversations out, or engaging in something that's maybe a little bit more subconscious that we bring to the consciousness, so that the work can be improved and the growth can be improved with that. So that's an example of how we do stuff. The other thing I want to show you is just a little, this is a guide for doing action research for within education settings. And this is, teachers use this, but you should be seeing steps in action research. And there's lots of different formations. I'm going to put 2 guides in chat for education. Those are the things that I know best. And I'm also going to put some resources that we use with teachers and we presented at conferences about how to engage in different steps in this process. But like general research, you identify a problem, you gather data, you interpret data, you act on that data, you evaluate it, and then you maybe rinse and repeat. And I mean, if you look at the work of Joseph Maxwell and a lot of the stuff that Sharon has written about research methods, this work can be circular, can be linear, but doesn't necessarily have to be. I mean, you could be gathering data and analyzing data at the same time. You could be changing your question at any point, and that could impact what you do. One of the most powerful things about action research is there isn't this expectation that you lock in on a research design. You develop a question, you do some work with it. It might lead you to a more interesting question, or somewhere where you choose to go instead of where you've been. There's a lot that we can talk about in terms of how action research is such a dynamic, iterative process. But I do want to I don't want to cut into Andrew's time, and I want to allow us to have a little bit of time to talk back and forth. So there's so many things I want to say that I'm not going to say, but I'll just start dumping some other things in chat that you might find useful. And feel free to follow up, email me if you have any questions, or I'll stay on after the session ends as well. So
thank you so much.
Andrew,
Those are excellent practical frames and applications. And I really appreciate you sharing how to memo and how to just think about these things in the life of people's practice, because that's how most of us are using this kind of research. So thank you. And as well, I put a piece from the SAGE Encyclopedia of Methods that I co-wrote with a colleague in India, Venkatesh Kumar, that just defines participatory approaches to evaluation, which overlaps with some of what Andy Danilchick just shared. So thank you, Andy. And Andrew Babson, It is all you.
All right, I need to share my screen. It says I need the host to enable screen sharing.
Okay, you should be able to do it now.
There you go.
Thanks. All right, here we go.
Yes, we see it.
All right, great. So this looks way more polished and official than I want this to be a little bit more casual and more of a dialogue, but I wanted to share just a few thoughts on ethnography and its relevance to what we're all doing and would like to continue doing. So you can Google ethnography. There's lots of definitions of it. But I wanted to share a piece that I have assigned in QMI in Anthropology of Education at Penn GSE. It's a really nice piece by Anthony Kwame Harrison. And what I like about it is that it tells a bit about the history of ethnography through the lens of one of its most famous practitioners, Bronislaw Malinowski. And why I think it's an important contribution to the literature on ethnography is that it's written by an African American scholar who brings a certain voice that has been, or a certain kind of voice that has been really left out of theorization about ethnography. So let me just point out a few things about ethnography that I think could be helpful and relevant to us, those of us researching possibility development. So first of all, ethnography nowadays assumes what could be called a reflexive stance. So who are the people writing? Graphy in ethnography comes from the Greek verb graphein, to write. And then who are those people, the ethnoi, which is the Greek word for tribes or groups. So who's doing the writing and who's being written about? What are the power relations there? So who are we as researchers as we interact with the people that we are working with to collect data, to learn more about whatever we want to learn more about? So these questions weren't really asked by ethnographers that much until maybe about 30 years ago. And before that, it was very common for an ethnographer to not really think much about their positionality or their stance, their relations among their fellow practitioners or to society at large. I'm not saying that people didn't do that, but I'm just saying that after 1986, a book called Writing Culture was written. There was a lot more discussion about this reflexivity. Who am I as a writer? Who am I as a researcher? And what is my relationship to the people that I am working with? So what does ethnography give us? So first of all, ethnography is really defined by what could be called a dual approach called participating and observing. So you're both participating in activities in a particular group, but you're also observing. So it's this kind of, you're kind of shifting your footing between being in a situation or a context in a community, but also being away from it. So in some ways you're an outsider, but in some ways you want to be an insider too. And you're using that tension to generate new knowledge. So what does ethnography give us then? Well, it helps us look at the how and the why, helps us look at causality. Joseph Maxwell, the researcher that Andy mentioned earlier, is really big on that latter. In other words, certain methods can give you an insight into cause and effect, but what ethnography can do is give you a really detailed look into the guts of that, learning the how and why as part of people's experience, part of their day-to-day lives. Also, there's a certain kind of poetic function to ethnography. In other words, there's a narrative or literary quality to ethnography, these days at least. Again, the sort of post-writing culture, post-1986, whereby vivid language and what famous anthropologist Clifford Geertz called thick description can really make a strong impression. And so there's a sort of moral question there about the impression made, and the responsibility of the researcher to be careful about the impression that they do make. So ethnography is always really engaged very strongly in this tension between the universal and the particular. Now, over the history of ethnography and whether that takes place in the discipline of anthropology or sociology or psychology, there's been kind of varying attention to the universal or the particular. So universal, what I mean by that is, what traits do all human beings share, or are there practices that all human beings engage in? Contrast that with an emphasis on the particular. So in what way is this particular context in this particular place really distinctive? And so ethnography really hones in on this dynamism between the universal and particular. But over the course of ethnography as a practice, that emphasis is kind of shifted back and forth. It's not exactly a new thing. I mean, you can read ancient histories. Herodotus is a good example, the Greek historian. There are many other examples of pictures, let's say accounts of people living in particular ways that are distinctive, and having that sort of provoke some curiosity, some interest. So we can fast forward. Again, this is just a quick snapshot, but if we fast forwarded to the Enlightenment era, so we're talking like late 1600s, 1700s, early 1800s, there was more of an interest in doing things systematically, to use this emerging scientific method to be methodical and precise about collecting observations and making sense of them. And ethnography will continue to evolve with new technologies and new methods, digital data collection, supercomputing, big data, but also arts-based research, which I have been involved in and write about. There will be new ways of doing participant observation, getting into that how and why, those how and why type of questions, making strong impressions on the audience. So what's the relevance for all of us here? So if we look at possibility development as a theory and approach and what makes it distinctive, I think my understanding, and please let's have a conversation about this, but my understanding is that what makes possibility development distinctive is that it's a systemic approach. So what we're trying to do is see, going back to Mike's presentation, how the individual is part of larger social groups, and how the individual's decision-making, how they might perceive their barriers to what they want to do, how that might be conditioned or shaped by larger forces that are more or less out of an individual's control. So we could see ethnography as being really important to understanding complex contexts well. We could look at universal versus the particular. So we could ask this about possibility development itself. In what way is possibility development something that's universal, Or is it really specific? Do we need to be reflexive and look at the context within which this theory developed? How applicable is it across contexts? So that can be asked. And then finally, going back to again, Mike, but also Andy's talk, how compatible is ethnography with other methodologies, but also how does it depend on our goal, right? So we might have a goal of testing the theory behind possibility development. We may have a participatory action research goal. We may want to do program building, evaluation. So ethnography can be deployed, but for what purpose? So those questions have to be considered. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Andrew. And I'm glad that you mentioned participatory action research. That was the one thing I did want to mention. Within action research, the subset of participatory action research, or even YPAR, youth participatory action research, can be a very powerful way of finding out how something works in a program, but also engaging people and being that change within that program itself. You know, when you're working with young people and equipping them to study what they're doing and to impact the communities around them, that could be a transformational way to get to the action, but also get to the knowledge and understanding. So I do want to add that in too, and I'm glad that you mentioned that, Andrew. And I know that that kind of research is really important to you too as well, Sharon.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I apologize, everyone. This is one of those pandemic things. My power has gone off and I was trying to figure out how to fix it. So my apologies. But thank you, Andrew Babson. I really appreciate what you shared and also how it dovetails so well with what Andy and Mike shared. And so what I would love to do in the remaining little bit of time, we have just under 10 minutes, but we have a little flexibility, hopefully. I'd love to take questions from the group. I would love for folks who are interested to share your questions with us. Harry, do you have a question?
Did you say Harry or Carrie?
I said Harry. Good to see you, Harry.
Hi, Sharon. I'll see you again tomorrow morning.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to it. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I've been having questions come up this whole time, but I guess what's freshest from your presentation, Andrew, that last idea about the universal and the specific as it relates to possibility mentoring. I'm wondering if there's been any research investigation into how other cultures engage with the concept of goals and how this framework of possibility mentoring might be understood by other cultures.
Great question. Thank you. I'll let our panelists answer.
That's a great question. I can be kind of particularist for a minute and avoid kind of universal statements by taking a little bit of what I learned from living in the part of South Africa where I learned and lived. A little slip there, but honestly, you learn so much when you do ethnography because you want to understand people and you want to be part of their world. You want to be a friend and you want to relate to them. And so in my context, I learned that the relationship between ancestors and the living, so to speak, is very important. So I learned that the time scale of life is very different. And the kinds of roles that people play in this particular part of South Africa where I live, but it's also common in other parts of that region, are linked to this cosmology or this vision of the cosmos or the universe and social relations. So in terms of mentoring, you don't just call on elders in your midst, you also call on the help of ancestors. And ancestors may be inhabiting people that are living right in front of you. It's very complex. So just going back to your original question, it can be related to these really fundamental ideas about what is the world and who are people and how are they related. And so in the case of this area where I worked in South Africa, mentoring and caring and interrelational, let's say just caring, is related to cosmology. It's related to this idea that personhood goes beyond what you might be able to see in front of you, and it's related to bigger, your model of the social world, which includes ancestors. Hopefully that's interesting for you.
Yeah, absolutely. It really got me thinking about what I've learned of other cultures in terms of rites of passage, something like a vision quest, where a person goes through a ceremony to do a lot of what possibility mentoring, I think, is aiming to do, which is for a person to figure out their purpose in life and what they want to do with their life. And then I think about how that relates to how different societies interact with division of labor. And just India comes to mind, this idea of the caste system. How would something like possibility mentoring, which I feel like really says to kids, you can do whatever you want to do. Let's just plan it out and make it happen. How does that come up against other cultures that have stricter guidelines and structures around division of labor and what a person can or is capable of doing in their lifetime, what kind of social mobility they're capable of?
Yeah, I love that question. It's great. Thank you, Harry, for sharing that.
Thank you, Harry. Any other, we can take
Exactly.
one more question, let's say. Any other, someone want to ask a question? Thank you, Harry. That was great. Any of the panelists want to share anything else? So words of wisdom or a thought or suggestion or resource that people can look to? There are many resources in the chat, everyone.
Sure.
But are there any other suggestions from the panelists or
Sharon,
any other questions?
Just to jump in quickly, I know Carrie unmuted a couple times, so she might be trying.
Great. Great. Carrie? Hi.
Muted, Carrie.
You're on mute.
Or your volume's really
Know
low.
that you're on mute, though.
Or maybe something. Headphones, maybe? Carrie, maybe you can type it in chat, your question. Or perform an interpretive dance that we can figure out.
You want to type your question or should we move on? Type your question. Move on.
It's like a really good game of charades.
This is the way it works, everyone. This is the work when you're working around the world on teams, as you all know, this is what it looks like. So it's natural.
I mean, I have an observation that maybe, I don't know if I should wait for Carrie.
Why don't you share that and then we'll close.
Yeah.
Carrie, you can stay on after and we can chat with you if that works for you.
I'm really struck at the, the intersections of the three of us talking about research, and the larger question is like, how do we know the things that we're interested in, and how do we look for change or be instruments of change in the work that we're doing? And, when Andrew's talking about how we can employ these things, or Mike's talking about different ways to represent looking at how things can change an individual over time. I think we all have these questions in front of us in the work that we do. Like, how do we know about it and represent it so that we can do it better, get more funding, have more success, and build on it. And, you know, I guess that's my observation. And my hope is that we can be a network and resource for each other to help each other know different ways to do that, you know, and build expertise in doing that. And so I guess my encouragement is that if you have interest around how to know the work better, how to employ different kinds of research things, I'm really hoping that we can help each other in that effort.
Yeah, I actually wanted to say something in response to that, because it's really important, this idea of helping. And one of the things that I always worry about is that a method drives a question rather than a question driving a method. So I've had a lot of situations where somebody asks me, Mike, should I do qualitative or quantitative? And I'll say, yes, though sometimes the answer is and.
Right.
And it's because, you know, you're at different stages of the research process. And, you know, it's always most important to respond to a question and to also ask your friends. So I ask Andy, I ask Mike, I ask Flavio, I ask Sharon, just to make sure that we're using the best methods to get us the best answer to any question we're interested in.
Thank you, Mike. We will end on that note. Thank you to all three of you for sharing your different vantage points into this kind of research. It's really useful since all the vantage points matter. And those of us doing this work will approach it in a variety of different ways. So thanks to each of you. Really, really appreciate you sharing your wisdom with us today. Thank you so much. And thank you, everyone. Thanks for coming to the session.
Thank you.
Thanks for moderating it, Sharon, and for providing the context that you did. All of the presenters were just fantastic there. And thank you all in the audience for sticking with us. We know it's tough to do these marathons, you know, so we've gone for nearly 4 consecutive hours. We'll stick around till noon and for individual questions people might have. And we'll pick it up tomorrow morning at 8 with again, a range of fabulous presentations tomorrow. Hopefully Carrie will be able to speak to us out loud because she's one of the fabulous presenters. So we now have a little trial run to make sure we get the technology right. But Flavio, any closing thoughts? And Andrew, as we wrap up?
No, this is such a fabulous day. Looking forward for tomorrow. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Better off, Flavio. See you tomorrow.
All right, see you all tomorrow. And again, we'll stick around. At least I'll stick around till about noon, after which I'll pass out or get something to eat, one or the other. Thanks, everybody. Hope to see you tomorrow. Hi, Naomi. I see your message in chat. Naomi Takasawa.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
For
next time
including
around,
me.
you know, next time around, you might have to be involved.
Yeah, I'll bring a Japanese team or East Asian team.
Naomi's one of the authors of an important chapter in our 3-volume series.
Thank you for including us.
Thanks for being here.
Yeah, I mentioned that I'm, sister-in-law.
Yeah. Well, today's an intro to this work, and tomorrow, by the way, we'll look at a platform that will help organize all of this and help build our community online. So,
okay.
If you're available, Naomi, come back for that. If not, I know I'll see you soon.
Yeah, I'll surely be back tomorrow.
All right. Take
Yeah,
care.
congratulate, on your, on your success.
Thank
This
you.
is fantastic. Yeah, see you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
So
Carrie,
I see we have a voice from Carrie in chat.
Oh,
Do you guys
Mike,
hear me now?
Can.
Yes, we can hear you. It's great to hear you.
Wow, great. Wow. So happy to be in the meeting virtually. Oh my gosh. Been over a year that I haven't seen you guys. Oh, wow. Hello, Steve.
So, Carrie, you have a question there about any thoughts or works on cultivating mentoring relationships and supporting possibility development virtually and cross-culturally. You might have missed our earlier presentation today, but there was a pretty strong focus on both virtual mentoring, because we did a year of it, and a pretty strong emphasis on cross-cultural stuff, even within the virtual mentoring. So there is that work that we're doing, and we're doing some writing on that now. But Sasha and others presented some, fabulous work on the virtual mentoring that we did this year under Andy's guidance. So there's work emerging in that arena for sure.
Yeah, I'll just briefly add that the cross-cultural stuff that we learned, that was I don't know if it was surprising, but it was really interesting, in how that there's affordances any which way a cultural dynamic is set up, and sometimes within cultures that seem similar, there's difference in challenge. Just because you might identify as you identify as African American doesn't mean you'll automatically connect with or understand other African American children you might be working with. But that might give you a place of connection, and certainly a place of modeling. So in working with, having African American mentors work with African American kids, there's something really fabulous about the students seeing, like, an African American male or female going to an Ivy League school and being older and having success. Similar thing when we've had Chinese international students mentoring Chinese students in schools, where they're able to connect, talking to each other in Mandarin or Cantonese or other kinds of languages, and there's a connection there. But we've also seen, when you're of different class, different ethnicity or race, having a way of disclosing about your race and your experience, and the kids doing the same thing, or having interest in asking and disclosing, that could be a powerful way to connect as well. And sometimes we see challenge where, kids, middle school kids, will be anxious about the differences of a mentor, and they might laugh or make jokes about stuff. But then when they start to move past that and actually authentically connect about their differences, or just their experiences and their cultures, there could be something really powerful happen. We see it happen in mentoring relationships, where there's an exchange of, like, oh, this is what your name would be in this language, or how to write it, or how to say it, and here's other language terms, and things like that. So, I think that it's a real open world for the kinds of cross-cultural connections to have. I think the most important thing is that, that there's good communication about that, and understanding about that, and that just because you're not of the same cultural background of a student doesn't mean that you can't be an effective mentor of them. It's just kind of rambled a little bit about that. I don't know if you have a response or particular follow-up question about that in the work that you're doing or thinking about.
Harry, I saw your message. Thank you for being here today. I'm sorry we'll miss you tomorrow, but everyone has conflicting schedules. But your question, as always, was a provocative and useful question.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye, everyone.
Take care.
Take care. See you.
Andy Schneider Munoz, any thoughts following the day? You're muted, Andy.